In 1798, France and Britain were once again at war. After gaining much fame and success in his Italian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to cripple France's enemies further, and to him there was no greater foe than the one that lay across the English Channel. He had a novel idea on how to accomplish this. He initially planned to attack Britain's wealth by invading British India by going through Egypt. The Directory in France, however, ordered him to only invade Egypt. He set sail from Toulon with 13 ships of the line, 14 frigates, and 400 transport ships. The British had heard of the build-up of forces near Toulon and had sent a fleet under Horatio Nelson to investigate. The stage was set for a naval battle that would decide the balance of power in the Mediterranean. On the 19th of May 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with the invasion force intended for Egypt. At roughly the same time, a small British squadron under Horatio Nelson was sailing through the western Mediterranean. It had been dispatched to investigate the French build-up of forces at Toulon and had left Gibraltar on the 9th of May. The French were sailing past the coast of Italy now. On the 21st of May, the British encountered a storm, and the winds were so powerful that it damaged the mast of Nelson's flagship and scattered his 3 frigates, who were unable to rejoin him. The 3 ships of the line sheltered close to a small island south of Sardinia. After repairing most of the damage, Nelson set sail for Toulon on the southern coast of France, and on the 7th of June he was joined by a much larger squadron of British ships. He now had enough ships to fight a battle against the French and sailed to Naples. On the same day, the French sailed past Sicily and reached Malta on the 9th of June. Napoleon wanted access to the harbour of Valletta, but the Knights of Malta denied him access, so he invaded the island and forced the Knights to surrender on the 12th. Napoleon spent a week resupplying at Malta and set sail for Crete on the 19th. In this same time, the British had reached Naples and asked King Ferdinand if they could borrow some of his frigates to use as scouts. He said no, and the British fleet left Naples for Syracuse in Sicily soon afterwards, which they reached on the 20th. On the 22nd, a merchant ship gave Nelson news that the French had captured Malta and set sail for Egypt. The timeline given to Nelson was off though. The merchants mistakenly claimed that the French left 3 days earlier than they did. Nelson immediately set sail for Egypt, and on the night of the 22nd he unknowingly passed the French fleet. If Nelson had more scouting frigates, or if the information he had received was more accurate, he may have been able to destroy the French fleet at sea. The British arrived at Alexandria on the 28th of June, but found no French fleet. Nelson decided to sail up the coast of the Levant, and less than a day later, the French arrived at Alexandria. Napoleon immediately invaded Alexandria and captured the city quite quickly. He disembarked his army and anchored his transport ships in Alexandria. The French battleships were too large to anchor there as well, so the French Admiral Brouilly, who Napoleon put in charge of the fleet, anchored inside Aboukir Bay, to the northeast of Alexandria. The British reached Turkey on the 4th of July and sailed back to Syracuse. Nelson was very frustrated with his inability to find the French. The British reached Syracuse on the 19th of July and resupplied there for 5 days. They sailed for Greece on the 24th, and finally, on the 28th at Coron in southern Greece, Nelson received news that the French had indeed invaded Egypt. He immediately set sail for Egypt and reached Alexandria 4 days later on the 1st of August. They spotted the French transports and knew the battle fleet must be close by. At 2 o'clock, HMS Zealous spotted the French battleships in Aboukir Bay. The British would have the battle they so eagerly awaited for months. The French fleet was anchored in Aboukir Bay, about 32 kilometers to the northeast of Alexandria. The bay was lined with extensive shoals, areas too shallow for the battleships to sail in. The French tried to make use of this by anchoring in such a way that the British would not be able to outflank them, and they even strung cables in between their ships so that the British could not get in between the ships, although in reality this didn't work as well as the French planned. The French line consisted of 12 third rates and a massive first rate placed in the centre. Usually third rates would have 74 cannons, whereas in this case the first rate had 120 cannons. The ship was nearly twice as powerful as any of Nelson's ships. To the west, Nelson had arranged his squadron into line and planned to fight the French that evening. To the north, Culloden was returning to the fleet after capturing a merchant vessel, and Swiftsure and Alexander were returning from scouting duties around Alexandria. The British cautiously approached the French fleet. They had no credible information on the extent of the shoals in the bay, so they took careful measurements of the depth of the water as they approached. In conventional sea battles during the Age of Sail, ships would form long lines and pass by each other, whilst firing broadsides. Normally the side with the most firepower and durability would come out victorious. However, in this context, Nelson saw that his leading ships would be severely battered by the time they reached the end of the French line. As the French sailors were less experienced than their British counterparts, a conventional battle would favour the French. As usual though, Nelson had a different plan. Nelson was a big proponent of defeat in detail, where force is concentrated in one place to overwhelm an enemy. As the wind was blowing against the French fleet, Nelson planned to do exactly that here. He wanted to arrange his ships so that for every French third rate there were 2 British ones firing at it, and he wanted 3 of his ships to deal with a massive French flagship in the middle. This way Nelson could overwhelm the front half of the French fleet without the rear being able to assist it, as a result of the winds. His ships would anchor in such a way as to provide cover to the ones behind them, ensuring that each of his ships would only ever be fired upon by one French ship. However, on approaching the French line, Captain Thomas Foley on the leading British ship, HMS Goliath, noticed that there was a gap between the front French ships and the shoals behind them. When Nelson formulated his original plan, he assumed that the French had anchored their ships in such a way that the British ships would not be able to get in between them and the shore. The French had made a horrible mistake. At around 20 minutes past 6, the front 2 French ships opened fire on HMS Goliath. At around 6:30, HMS Goliath crossed in front of the French line. It was followed by 4 other British ships. HMS Vanguard was the first British ship to continue with the original plan and anchored next to the 3rd French ship. Nelson's example was followed by the other captains. Soon, the British ships were placed in such a way that most of the ships in the French vanguard were outnumbered 2-1. The British could not have hoped for a better start to the battle. Not everything had gone perfectly though. HMS Majestic had overshot her position and was now further down the French line than intended. Further north, HMS Culloden ran aground on the shoals, and HMS Leander stayed back to try and pull her free. The British were already down a ship, but that would have little impact on the result of the battle. The French had not expected there to be a gap between their front ship and the shoals. They did not prepare their cannons on the side facing land, and in some cases they even packed equipment around the cannons, meaning that they would need even more time to start using them. At around 7 o'clock, after being badly damaged by fire from Audacious and Goliath, the French ship Conquérant surrendered. By this time, Guerrier, the front French ship, had been completely dismasted and badly damaged as a result of the fire from HMS Zealous. The crew of the French ship, however, stubbornly refused to surrender, even though Zealous could now fire on them with impunity. Going further down the line, HMS Vanguard was dealing with Spartiate, the 3rd French ship in the line, when the 4th French ship, Aquilon, turned to fire on it. As a result of being fired upon by 2 ships, Vanguard took considerable damage. Even Nelson himself was injured, although the injury was not serious. However, in turning his ship, the captain of the Aquilon had exposed its stern to raking fire from HMS Minotaur. Raking fire simply means that the cannonballs pass along the length rather than the width of the enemy ship. This causes much more damage than if the ships were parallel. At this point, all the French ships in the front half of their line were taking damage. HMS Bellerophon was engaging Orient and sustaining heavy damage as well. By 10 to 8, Bellerophon was dismasted, and at around 20 past 8, Captain Darby ordered that the ship's anchors be cut so that it could drift away from Orient. HMS Majestic entangled with Tonnant, and in the fight her captain was killed by musket fire. but the crew managed to free her and she drifted further south and fought two French ships simultaneously. At around 8:30, HMS Leander abandoned her efforts to pull Culloden off the shoals and joined the battle. She entered the gap between Pupil Sovereign and Franklin. By 9 o'clock, both Guerrier and Sparty had surrendered. Some of the British ships moved further down the line. At the same time, the British noticed a fire on Orient. Swiftsure focused on the fire on Orient to prevent the French from putting it out. Aquilon surrendered at 9:30, and by now there were 4 British ships pouring fire into Orient. The French crew were unable to put out the fire and it spread throughout the ship. The surrounding ships knew it was only a matter of time before the ship exploded. Both British and French ships stopped firing, closed their gun ports, wetted their sails, and got ready to extinguish any secondary fires caused by the explosion of Orient. The ships also tried to distance themselves from Orient. Hureau and Mercure both cut their anchors and slowly drifted onto the shoals. At around 10 o'clock, the fire on Orient reached the magazine and ignited the gunpowder stored there. An enormous explosion ripped through the ship and scattered debris as far as 250 meters away. And nearly 1,000 men died on Orient, including Admiral Bruy. Secondary fires were started on other ships by flaming debris, but they were all put out. For 10 minutes after the explosion, no shots were fired, as everyone was shocked by what had happened. Orient had been completely destroyed by the explosion. Franklin soon opened fire on HMS Swiftsure, but due to swift backlash from the British, Franklin surrendered at 10:20. Throughout the night, Tonnant and HMS Majestic were the only ships fighting each other, as Tonnant slowly drifted closer to the French rear division. Most ships were repairing damage and tending to their wounded. By 4 o'clock the next morning, the French rear division started firing at Majestic and Alexander, but the French were soon outgunned as Theseus and Goliath joined the fight. Seeing that their situation was hopeless, the French rear division under Rear Admiral Villeneuve attempted to retreat. Tonnant had been dismasted and Timoleon's rudder was destroyed, so only Genereux and Guillaume managed to escape. Later that morning, 4 British ships forced the surrender of Hureau and Mercure, who were now stranded on the shoals, and the next day the British captured Tonnant. The crew of Timoleon destroyed their own ship before the British could capture it. Nelson later remarked, "Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene. The British had won a complete victory." British casualties totaled 218 killed and 678 wounded, with Vanguard, Bellerophon and Majestic the most damaged ships. French casualties were much more severe, with nearly 1,000 deaths on Orient alone. The total number of casualties were around 2,000 killed and 2,500 wounded, including Admiral Bruy and 4 captains. The French also lost 11 battleships. After the battle, the British consolidated their prizes. They stayed in the bay for 2 weeks and monitored the events that were taking place in Egypt. The thousands of French prisoners captured were also released and allowed to rejoin Bonaparte. Despite the loss, the French still managed to take over large portions of Egypt. The campaign ultimately failed, though, because Napoleon was recalled to defend France, as the Directory lost a number of battles against the Second Coalition. Napoleon later ousted the Directory through a coup d'etat, and many of the officers that journeyed with him to Egypt later became marshals of the empire. Nelson was already famous for his actions at Cape St. Vincent, but when news of his victory reached Britain, he became a living legend. He was widely praised as a hero by the British press. He received many awards and titles from grateful governments and kings across Europe. The French defeat resulted from terrible tactical mistakes made by its officers, and excellence from the British ones. Ultimately, the French lost this battle 9 years before it began. Many of its best naval officers were part of the nobility that were purged in the Reign of Terror. As one British admiral once said, "It takes 3 years to build a battleship and 300 years to build a naval tradition." And in the space of 3 years, from 1789 to 1792, the French had thrown away their naval tradition, and that, more than anything, contributed to the scale of this defeat.